Started. So I am your host, Matt Soeth, fearless leader, I should say, of the Trust and Safety Collective. I'm excited to be here at Spectrum Labs, head of Trust and Safety, joined today by a few good folks. We'll kick it off. First, I'd love to introduce Samir Hinduja. Samir, please tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello, Matt. It's good to see you again. And I spend my time with my colleague, Dr. Justin Patchen, co-directing the Cyberbullying Research Center. And that may sound like all we do is research, but that's not true at all. We actually work with a number of platforms in order to assist them as it relates to policy and messaging, getting informed data that can help them with decisions related to feature sets, engineering, comms, marketing, and then overall, what we can do to respond to problematic behavior and what we can do to induce positive behavior and civility. So love what I do and I'm glad to see some familiar names in the participant window and look forward to hopefully being an asset to those who've come.
Excellent. No, excited to have you here, Samir. I know we've had so many great conversations working over the years and my various tech roles. Appreciate your insight. Chris, introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, I'm Chris McGuffey. I'm the research director at Spectrum. In that role, I oversee our behavioral definitions. So everything that we build AI around, I work on setting those lines and parameters. My background is more loosely in international security, extremism research, but I came to this work through that lens in terms of not only how bad actors leverage technology, but also the differences between online behaviors and offline behaviors and the relationship between the two. So lots of overlap in the ways we all behave online, and I'm happy to be here talking about cyberbullying today.
We talk about all the fun stuff in trust and safety. It's what we do.
Yes.
Okay, well, as we kick it off, at TikTok, I had the unique privileged opportunity, I've been working in the online safety space for a bit, but to lead up and help drive a lot of our bullying harassment initiatives at that platform early days, a couple years ago, and got to work with some really great folks. And one of the things that came up working with external experts was the number one issue that we see in and across tech is, how do you define bullying and harassment, right? That is such a clear sort of first step and how do you can't address a problem unless you know what it is and have it categorized. So it's kind of our first question, the biggest issues is, what does a good definition look like? And is there kind of a follow-up? I mean, is there a way to get sort of consensus on that? But Samir, I kind of want to start with that, with your work with cyberbullying research and Justin and everything else, like how do you go about defining bullying and harassment, and particularly in thinking in terms of a platform and how we could respond to it? Sure.
Well, I want to say that you explore some of these issues in your new white paper on cyberbullying, and so perhaps that link could be posted in the chat. And the way that I think about it is that you don't want to be too specific and you don't want to be too broad. And so there's some elements which others might think are very pertinent, whereas I might say, you know what, we're just getting into the weeds now and we're missing the picture in that someone is being targeted and someone is being victimized. For me, the essential elements are as follows. Of course, we have to have harm taking place, but perhaps not my definition of harm or your definition of harm. If we have a user who is struggling in some capacity and it's articulable and it's understandable, then I think that we should take them at their word. Secondly, intent is a big issue. Obviously, some people mouth off and say the wrong thing just because they're trying to troll or push someone's emotional buttons, but we're wanting to make sure that there's intentional behavior and it's occurring more than once. You might differentiate harassment from cyberbullying by thinking of the former as something that occurs as a one-off behavior. Cyberbullying tends to be a little bit more pernicious, tends to be something that is occurring and is inflicting harm, which leads to fear, leads to feelings of unsafety. And of course, as platforms, we care deeply about making sure that that's not something that's relevant or growing, because we want to make sure our user base is content and enjoying, because that'll lead to more engagement, that'll lead to less churn, and that'll lead to growth.
Yeah, I love that, less churn and growth. Chris, kind of adding to that, from your perspective, a majority of your role here at Spectrum is doing research, right? And how do we sort of operationalize this? So from Samir's point, starting with sort of the definition and then going into practice, how do we apply that definition into action?
Yeah, so I just shared this anecdote yesterday with Matt, but in preparing to talk to you all today about this, I was looking back at the history of my specific research on this behavior for AI solution, and I figured out that actually one of the definitions that I found that helped pull some of the other best practices and definitions together was the one that Samir and his organization created. So that was lovely. It was actually cited in some literature that I had reviewed. And I was like, oh, yes, I'm very familiar with this. And operationalizing it is key, right? So we're detecting text, and text does not scope all the nuance of human behavior. So we have to be very specific about what we can find and what that means. So we also have to look at that across the globe, across platforms, across cultures and languages. So we need something that will work for all types of companies. And we have to find what's universal. And then when we find those universal elements, which works really well with actually intent, you can kind of substitute targetedness in terms of the way language is formed for intent. Harms are how we actually that's foundational to how we look at all of the behaviors that are problematic that we detect. But that repetition too, and scoping what that looks like and being adaptable to changes, because people are always changing how they are harmful to one another. So finding those core elements and then determining precisely what's transferable between languages and cultures and even different verticals is really, really important. And in that way, trying to, as we all do in the AI space, try to work with bias and be very eyes wide open and smart about the fact that we're human beings, we have our own limitations, we have our own experiences with difficult behaviors. Most people have been bullied. So you have to factor that in when you're setting up definitions that you then are using to train AI around. But humans are humans. We're mammals. We have patterns, and we try to misbehave in similar ways. And so that's where the awesomeness of massive amounts of data floating around really help, because you can say, my theory is this, I think this is universal, and then you can check. Does this look the same on a gaming platform as it does on a social platform, as it does on a dating platform, across languages? And then you can confirm your theories. And so that's kind of the landscape of definitions that I work with. But being adaptable, really, really important, especially in this trust and safety space where everything is always changing.
Chris, I love what you said about context and culture. When you think about the variety of our user populations, not just, of course, race and country, but also age. And so, we truly have to be thinking about all these variables when we're figuring out what to do exactly. And so, moving from your definition, I also think it's very important to consider the continuum of harm that could take place. You could have the umbrella term of cyberbullying over a variety of harms, without a doubt, and it could involve name calling and insults and cruelty via posts. But then you get into exclusion and rejection, which could be repeated, involving specific behaviors, but also the absence of specific behaviors. And then you get into identity-based harm, racism, sexual harassment, and of course, threats. And so thinking about what that looks like, and of course, defining it in policy and figuring out, okay, identification is extremely important, and then moving into prevention and response, whether that's manual moderation, of course, advising our staff, as well as automatic moderation, advising the models.
Mm-hmm. No, and as we think about that, because Samir, I loved your early point, right, where it needs to be, specific yet still somewhat broad, right, malleable, and like Chris, you're talking about it pivots and changes consistently, and going back to my own experience, one as a parent now, and how my kids are very good at bullying each other. It's just the nature of being siblings, versus their friends at school. And as a teacher for a long time, you see how many different ways this can take shape and take form. Why, as a platform, I'm more specific, thinking about, so let's say we have a policy, we're looking at data. What are some of the data that we could look at in order to determine like the types of bullying that may be happening? Would that be coming from user reports? Could that be looking at, trends and terms? What are some thoughts that either of you have on that?
both of us are all about research, and so I think that we would advocate for getting a feel for exactly what's going on in nuanced ways. You could ask some very generic questions, but then you can drill down to fully understand the experiences, the contextual factors, the elements that might contribute to specific populations being targeted in specific venues. What venues are they? Are they more public? Are they more private? And then thinking about, okay, so we've provided our users with a host of tools at their disposal. Are they using them? If so, how? And if not, what can we do in order to reduce friction so that they are being used more often? And then similarly, how can we also engage the community to be somewhat of moderators themselves in terms of setting the tone, setting expectations, behavioral norms, and ideally building an environment where once problematic behavior surfaces, it's sort of quelled, not just, of course, by the company, but by the user base.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and the checks and balances, knowing that there's no perfect definition, so and therefore there's no perfect technology to detect. There's not going to be perfect moderation. We don't live in this perfect place, but we know that we can slice and dice. So we know there are component behaviors, as Samira mentioned. A lot of this is really helpful in terms of like, what is actually the result? And that's a lot of like bouncing back and forth, like what's the nature of the harm? And so therefore, how is that connected to what is actually showing up on a platform? So if you know, for example, that a lot of the bullying that's occurring is within kind of the regular insults, abuse kind of spectrum of behaviors, then there are specific harms associated with that, especially for children. If there's a lot more things like hate speech or threats, then we know we're in a different ballpark, not only for risk and security for a platform, but for really serious harms for human beings. Is someone being threatened and doxxed? Is someone moving away from their home to feel safer because of what's happening online? This happens with targeted harassment and bullying. So if you already have ways of looking for bullying, knowing you're looking for component behaviors, the check and the balances, you can separately be looking for those behaviors, maybe in not the precise way where we're looking for intent and repetition, but you can still sometimes surface a bully that might not have quite reached the threshold of being on some moderator's radar for being a bully, but they could be for repeated hate speech or threats. And so there are very crafty ways that you can use the same type of data and compare what's going on. And you're looking for humans. So that's where a combination of looking at the content, but also looking at user-based methods to make sure that what we usually find is there are a very small handful of people who are behaving badly and everybody else who maybe just needs a few reminders of how to be more civil and tolerant of one another. And that way you can cover yourself and feel more like you're really protecting people, whether or not it's something that's just below the threshold of bullying and has those component behaviors, or for sure is actually ringing all the alarm bells for bullying and harassment.
I love that you brought that up. In terms of a guiding framework, I'm always thinking about the Pareto principle, where 80% of the results are due to 20% of the inputs, but specific to gaming and social media harm, you think about the work of our friends, Kim Ball and Natasha Miller, and how they've identified that it's 1 to 5% who are repeatedly disruptive, and the rest are occasionally disruptive due to context or emotion or acting based on spontaneity. And so, yes, for sure, it could absolutely still be harm. It could be cyberbullying or however we're characterizing it, but there's reasons. And so that brings promise and hope in terms of being able to meaningfully affect this population and help with this problem when it comes to policies, when it comes to programming, when it comes to feature sets. Can absolutely make a difference and reduce the prevalence of this problem.
No, and I love that you brought up all of those components, Samir, right? Like policies, feature sets, et cetera, that it's not just any one thing. It's not like we're going to go into school, hey, kids, be nicer to each other. Like, oh, the problem disappeared. Or, as a platform, it's like, oh, well, we're going to increase our moderation team to like use reports. Like there's an ecosystem at play there, right? Starting with the policy and values of the platform, then disseminating down to that enforcement, whether it's proactive moderation to detect a lot of the more illicit, egregious behaviors, versus moderators on, that 5% where, it's a gray area or it's a small subset, right? And being informed consistently, along with all the tools and resources, community nudges, positive metrics. There's a whole thing we talk about in there, right? To that end, as we think about, I have so many directions I want to go right now. As we start to get into this stuff, I'm going to skip questions in order a little bit here, because I think we kind of touched on this, but historically, early days of bullying and harassment was heavily reliant on user reports, mostly because so much context could be missing. I'll give you an example. Like when I was a teacher, I would have a kid come up to me like, Mr. Soeth, so-and-so hates me. And I'm like, no one woke up hating you. Like, what happened? Like, I was just in math class and they were mugging me. I'm like, why are they mugging you? Like, I don't know. I was just doing my homework. And then as an admin, you do your investigation, you look at the data, you pull people in, you get some in, you come to find out someone said something about someone else and it was in a chat room, and then it got on Instagram, and then it got sent as a direct message. And next thing you know, like they want to have a fight or someone's angry about something and they mug them in math class, and then they come to me because they don't know how to deal with it anymore. So as we think about like user reports, they can make sense because as the platform, you action something and find out there's so much other data that's missing. So as we think about that, how do we get to a point, to make users feel safe? And, back to your earlier point, reduce, churn, Samir, because they want to stay on the platform. But how do we get to a point of going beyond user reports, potentially doing some proactive detection or having some kind of positive features in a platform to help us action content that would identify as bullying and harassment?
I think it starts with, of course, I want to hear from Chris. I think it starts with, setting the tone about what this platform wants to major in. What are their priorities in terms of value systems, and how are they going to tap into all of the various sorts of, I guess, vectors that can lead to that. Of course, you have mentioned policy, and we think about AI, and we think about the community-driven solutions as well. But you need to identify, according to your unique situation, your platform and how it works, what is best. If it's a specific game, we've seen that loading streams can be used in order to provide prompts about what is acceptable. It just has reminders, which I think everyone needs. We've seen warnings used as little instances of cognitive dissonance to give pause to a user before they post something that has been flagged in the past or is similar to some content that has been flagged in the past. And so you have to figure out what might work in terms of your user base and what they'd be most receptive to, I would say.
Yeah, I to add to that too, there's so many elements, there's structural elements, and even within one platform, let's just take gaming, and there's multiple games and lots of different types of communities that play those games. There's a lot of wonderful decision making that can go into changing small structural elements. Matt, as a teacher, all the tricks when you change one little thing, and it could be just the amount of freedom, how people are arranged, how much time they have in online spaces. You have a lot of choice about the freedom that you give people for user-generated content, and the mechanisms for actually moderating that. So there's lots of ways to put the power back in the hands of the community too, because you can also basically gently nudge people in the right direction by simply not allowing them as much freedom in certain ways. At the same time, there are situations when it's, say it's a platform that's almost all mature adults, or it's a gaming platform that is a bit more mature, and you want to allow people to do some trash talk. You expect there will be bonded communities of people who might use harsh language, and some of that could get caught up in detection and look something like bullying. But if you know your community and you know what your values are, and you're able to draw those lines more firmly, then you can customize, as Samir is talking about, like it's the same type of element. Like you have to know what you really want and what is acceptable to normalize on your platform first, but then you can have a lot of sway in terms of freedom in there. And then when you do have a problem or you have something unexpected, which you should always expect the unexpected online, then you can adapt because you already have done that hard thinking. We know what our values are. We know we want more freedom in these communities. We know we want these more, these guardrails or these structural elements in these other places. And then you don't have as much under pressure decision making when you have a worrisome trend. And I did want to address that too, in terms of intent. There's a big difference between people deciding, getting up in the morning, to go back to your example, and deciding to be a bully that day versus coordinated bullying and harassment. Bullying and harassment can be weaponized and coordinated as a tactic by people online who want some end result. And platforms aware of that and seeing what's out there beyond the scope of their platform or even their industry will see differences in how bullying shows up. And therefore, there should be differences in how different types of bullying is moderated. If it's just an individual who's behaving badly, that should naturally look differently and be handled differently than a whole bunch of people all of a sudden showing up coincidentally targeting people for protected attributes or on specific topics. And we're going to see a lot more of that during election cycles and other big world events. And so I did want to point that out, because you can also create structural elements to accommodate those circumstances. And if they haven't arrived on your platform yet, they will eventually. And being prepared will, again, give you more peace of mind and greater protection for your users.
And that reminds me of the work of one of our other friends, Wes Hardover, Player Dynamics over at Riot, and how he's constantly carrying the torch related to that specific message. But overall, what you said, Chris, makes me think about how I really believe it's incumbent on the platform in order to create an environment in which users feel supported when they report, whether they're reporting their own targeting and victimization, or they witnessed it and they are trying to come through for a loved one, or simply appear. You know, you wonder, like, what does the feedback loop look like? Not in terms of how frequently or how quickly you respond, but how detailed are the reports? Sorry, not the reports, but how detailed is the follow-up? And then the platform doesn't necessarily need to be disclosing all of the details of the actioning. In many cases, they shouldn't, but it helps when you let the reporter know that, okay, we've moved forward on this, we were able to do this in whatever limited fashion you can disclose. That even helps with preventing traumatic outcomes. And it actually increases the ownership or the investment that the user has in that community, because they're like, wow, I feel like someone's got my back when I took the time to reach out, to drum up the courage and to, push through the fact that I really wanted to just kind of keep living my life and move on in order to report, in order to keep this community safer.
Yeah, these are all great points. And just a shout out to folks, remember, if you want to ask some questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Again, so many directions we can go right now. As we think about, I want to backtrack a little bit, as we think about working with external experts, what are ways platforms can work with experts to kind of connect, whether it's improving policy, data, research, but what are some of the best ways, particularly when it comes to like defining and implementing and enforcing bullying and harassment policies?
I would say that it's understandably tricky for the platform because they generally want to keep a lot in-house. But there's so much benefit, I think, to working with external partners under NDA, because they provide a fresh perspective. Typically there's this hive mind that's created within platforms, and they may not see all the various angles that they need to see when they're making decisions about policy, even though, of course, they're conducting focus groups with specific segments of users, et cetera. Just a third-party perspective really does help open eyes. And so I think that research, of course, is essential. And then moving forward from that, constantly soliciting the input from a number of different disciplines, whether that's pediatricians and others who work specifically with youthful populations, or whether it's mental health professionals, or whether it's criminologists. There's just a lot to be thinking about related to deterrence and related to encouraging civility, that I think many of these disciplines can provide that insight. And that looks like safety advisory boards, that looks like one-on-one consultancies, but I've just found that it's incredibly helpful for the platform to do so.
I'm a big fan of just putting on the analytical cap, and I need to put myself in the shoes of platforms every day. And I know There are so many directions that platforms are pulled in. They have a lot to manage. And so specifically with bullying, you could take any behavior, but bullying, it's very concerning. And we know it's a hot button issue for a lot of communities and in our society right now. When I think of expertise and scoping, say I'm somebody who's really in charge of coordinating that on the platform side. I think there's several buckets to consider. And one is, have we actually done the work to diagnose what may be actually going on our platform? Because you want to reduce the scope to what is reasonable, because you can get really caught up and overwhelmed, and then sometimes have decision-making processes get derailed because you can't know bullying the world over in every language and culture. It's impossible. And so knowing precisely like, hey, what is really happening for us? As Samir mentioned, like if you have good user reporting systems and you have trust and your users know that they can be vulnerable and give you that information, and you have the data related to moderation, and you have a sense of where your company is going, maybe you've grown recently, maybe you're offering different segments of your platform, maybe you have new games, or maybe you have different interactive offerings that have changed the nature of what human beings are doing, you can know, okay, I'm going to reduce it down to these variables for now. You have to have your hypothesis, or otherwise you're going to get overwhelmed. So that's the first bucket. It's like, be the expert on your own platform. But then there's the bucket of, do we know enough about bullying and harassment? Have we scoped it appropriately? Have we defined it appropriately? So that when we match it up to what actually happens on our platform, we haven't missed anything. We don't know what we don't know, right? But we can guess. So guess well. Make sure that you're accessing that information, which there's a ton of great information. But then there's two other areas that I feel like sometimes we miss. And one is really calling upon the internal experts within your platform who really know the people and the nuance of how everything works every day, because they're going to see, they're in it. So the people waiting around, the moderators, people who really have to get into the nitty-gritty of enforcement are going to be some of your best experts, and make sure that they have a seat at the table, because they have insights that no one else is going to have about what's actually happening. And then to go back to language and culture, sometimes it's that simple. Sometimes we have forgotten that there's been a shift of users on the platform. And when I say language, I don't necessarily mean, English, Spanish, Portuguese. I mean, like, maybe you have a whole bunch of Zoomers that you didn't have last year, and they speak differently than millennials and Gen Xers and boomers. And so literally you can have a language problem, you can have a translation problem, you can have a difficulty understanding what's happening. So make sure you have people who actually know how folks are communicating, and those kind of cultural and subcultural elements, and then give each set of experts their due in terms of making decisions, because we do have to be experts in very niche areas now. And as long as everybody has a say, and you can use that analytical process to say, okay, I think we know big picture what's going on, and let's make sure we get down to every single element before we make a policy change or a structural design change, then you can be covered and not be constantly second guessing or having to audit how you manage moderation and enforcement.
Yeah, that's such a great call out. Even the generational language difference, right? Between, one is just how are my kids embracing tech versus how I embraced it. I still know my ICQ number. I'm dating myself there. But my son and my daughter and how they engage in tech, and they're 4 years apart, is very different, right? So even when I talk to former students who have siblings now in high school, and they're like, I don't know what they're doing, so like, this is really weird. So it's kind of funny to see just that within a few years, right, how we choose to engage with tech, embrace it, things like that is very different, which is very important. I think one of the topics I hear a lot, and there's a way to frame it, but having youth involved in the conversation, right? I know Samir, CRC does a very good job of this in terms of doing like annual reviews or interviews, There's a really good book out, I think, highlighting that voice that I've kind of enjoyed. Is Behind Their Screens with Carrie James and Emily Weinstein out of Harvard. I thought they did a very good approach to sort of bridging the parent and teen gap when it comes to understanding tech, right? And that could be a biggest part to bullying and harassment, is understanding how the tech is being used. And so thinking of that, what are smart ways to include young people in the conversation, not only to understand how they're using the tech, but the types of harms they're seeing that just may be beyond our range of understanding? How would you both sort of advise about approaching that from a platform standpoint, to one, being involved, being heard, but then also just being very proactive and having something of value?
I mean, I've seen platform specific and platform sponsored events where they're able to pull together youth, whether it's for panels, whether it's for other trainings. And as some of you know from experience, when you validate the voice of youth, they're so much more willing to speak up and to clue you in on all the things that they're experiencing. And even down the road, they'll follow up with you simply because they were like, wow, those adults gave me a chance to share my experience and what I'm dealing with. And so I think that those can be fun. I think those can quickly gain a lot of traction amongst youthful populations. And I think they should be used more often. And of course, you can have adults organize an MC to sort of shepherd the conversation, maybe provide accountability here or there when it comes to what they decide to do moving forward. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of promise.
Yeah, I think in terms of involving youth as stakeholders, allowing them to be instructors, we all like to be asked questions, right, that we know something about. And if you start from the beginning and you say, hey, bullying seems to mean this for a lot of us in tech, but what does it actually mean for people in your age group? Like, I think that level setting is so important, because as much as we think we can figure things out and puzzle crack, and as a researcher, like, it's your job to try to find meaning and answers, and do that rather quickly sometimes when we're talking about online environments, we can't ever make assumptions about what is fundamentally different about the experience of being on the planet within a certain age group. We can imagine, we can have empathy. As you get older, you can be like, well, I've seen everything, but you've never actually walked in the shoes of somebody who's a few generations younger than you. And so really making sure that we're even having the same conversation, because what we might consider bullying and harassing behaviors might actually be something that is described differently, defined differently, and to make sure that we're actually even in the ballpark sometimes with younger generations, because we don't ever want to impose definitions and then follow through with policy and moderation and enforcement. If we actually are misunderstanding on fundamental levels what people are trying to convey, if you take trying to understand somebody's sense of humor as an example of that, like, you can talk until you're blue in the face about why something is funny. But something being funny is a lived experience, and that is so unique to who we are and what age we are and how we were raised and our experiences. And that's something that I feel like we forget with youth, and especially when we're talking about the nature of technology and people growing up very, very online. It's going to be so different no matter how much we learn about others. We have to let them kind of actually tell us the larger story before we can get into the weeds of how we need to approach things differently.
And Matt, you're bracketing youth because it's arguable that they're a vulnerable population, and that makes me think about how platforms need to be so intentional in identifying other vulnerable populations. Those who are differently abled, those who are transgender, even influencers. I've worked with platforms in order to specifically study the unique experiences of influencers who are basically living their lives out loud online. What are their unique concerns and fears and experiences? And so, yeah, I mean, intentionality is huge, and it takes the team of the platform in order to identify, all right, these are our specific populations, these are our specific problems.
No, yeah, and to reduce it to the individuals, to go back to what we started with, like, we're talking about harms to people, we're talking about harms and risks to the places that people connect, all these platforms, and so we have to actually bring it back down to the reality of if we were all in the same room today, you know, how we would think about it. And a lot of what I do is imagine what is actually happening when I see certain user generated content occurring. But again, as Samir mentioned, like it's very different if you are an influencer and 1 million people are following you versus if you're somebody who is very quiet and small and even maybe does not use your actual name online. And if we don't kind of red team different scenarios for harms in those particular ways, we're going to miss the boat when it comes to what could happen if we made X, Y, and Z policy decision or neglected to enforce in a certain way, because there's no one way to handle bullying or have it impact a human being, for sure.
And just to quickly build on that, you know, trust and safety teams, they are overextended and slammed and under-resourced and much smaller than they should be. And so it's very easy to be just thinking about these reports that are coming in or these problems as just another thing that you have to do that day. But like Chris is saying, and kind of like I do, I'm thinking about how this could be my brother, this could be my mom, this could be someone that I deeply care about. And so, yeah, I want to approach the situation in that light, and then hopefully that compels me to passionate action, which can then, of course, have positive effects for the rest of our user base.
Yeah, very much so. And it kind of has me thinking to the points you shared, right? Like we've seen a lot of important things happen online, most recently with the Amanda Todd sentencing over in with the Dutch gentleman who got 13 years for that sextortion and bullying and harassment case. We've seen regulation come down in terms of asking platforms to try and enforce more content, particularly with potential dire consequences, right? Extreme situations. One area you both kind of got me thinking, one is protected groups, right? So we've seen an increase of attacks on transgender people. We've seen an increase. LGBTQ Gamergate was in 2015, but we're still seeing high rates of misogyny online. I'm curious because there's trying to focus in specific, but where is that line, or how can platforms think about policy when it goes from being bullying and harassment into hate speech? Because that it can get blurred a little bit depending upon who's being targeted. Yeah, journalists too. Yeah. So where is that point when platforms should start thinking about policy like, yes, this is bullying harassment, or like this is straight hate speech? How can we sort of draw that line in order to take appropriate action on a platform?
I personally believe they should be separate sections in community guidelines because of the weight and gravity associated with each. And that also conveys to your user base that, look, we're treating this seriously. We're not packaging it or bucketing it with some of these other areas because it's a focal concern for us.
In terms of looking, both detecting it and also having policy, you know, we know that hate speech is part of certain types of bullying, just like we had mentioned threats as well. And that's why really making sure we know what type of bullying is occurring is huge in terms of moderation and enforcement. So we can't just, it's not a one-to-one. Obviously, there are elements of hate speech is always a very serious offense. We know it leads to violence in the real world. But we know that bullying in the absence of hate speech can lead to suicide and horrific outcomes for human beings. So we can't make assumptions necessarily, but we can make smart, pragmatic decisions and know that if there's bullying with hate speech, then it should automatically be elevated to a higher level of concern. But bullying without hate speech, that is prolonged, that is repetitive, should also be elevated to a higher level of concern. So you should have all those levers in place and understand. And as Samir mentioned, like if you understand what hate speech is and you understand the interactive quality, the repetition of bullying, and you know that they are mixed together, then it shouldn't be a problem in terms of saying, hey, we're seeing a little bit of both. And we know when we see that, we handle it this way. We're seeing the absence of hate, but that does not necessarily mean that this bullying is less severe. We need to look at the other elements. And so it's more of a mixing and matching of, you know, looking at message level, looking at user level, and being able to maneuver appropriately.
Yeah, no, I love that. So I was trying to give a few seconds there for stuff to process. It's the teacher, right? 7 seconds of wait time. It's always longer than you think. Um, yeah, I love it. On the same page. Yeah, definitely differentiating the policy. I think trying to look at data patterns of behavior, right? You can indicate if something has gone from general harassment. There's so many potential touch points in there, from looking at how long a user's been in a platform, the types of comments, who they're following, how many followers, and think in terms of product and feature tools to kind of limit those negative interactions potentially, right? Particularly when it comes to like live streaming comments, things like that. Like I said, so many directions we can go in. I think with the bullying harassment, it's interesting. Seeing a lot of stuff online lately, particularly around with elections coming up. I think those will be good marquee points to look at. Definitely keeping in mind what is the type of interactions on the platform, whether gaming, dating, or social. That changes thing. Like I have a friend, we talk so much trash when we go bowling, and for us it's funny because neither one of us is a good bowler. But it makes it more interesting, right? And then we can have like dumb bets, like who's going to break 80, which if you're a bowler is not that good, but it's fun. And so as we drop into that, thinking about in environments where sometimes trash talk is allowable, or, you know, friends, context, other stuff, let's look at the broader community health, right? So bullying harassment is an element of any platform. So as we look at the broader community health, there's a lot of variables there, both positive and negative. So it's not all doom and gloom. So as we think about community health, what are some ways that we could sort of encourage those positive behaviors, sort of nudge people in the right direction, that will indirectly then limit bullying and harassment issues, right? The more positive the community, the fewer of those things, back to that 80-20 principle, that 5%. What are some things we can do to sort of measure community health, or certainly encourage a more positive community within a platform?
I love that you're bringing this up. You know, I tend to approach everything with a positive slant. You know, what can we do in order to, you know, just make sure that people have a great time and they stay engaged and they enjoy their experience on our platforms. And so I would say that Chris mentioned this previously, just about how, you know, the platform and the employees therein, they know it inside and out. And so we need to continue to, of course, try different things. We need to experiment, and then we need to see what works. And hopefully platforms can also learn from each other. I think about way back in the day, we had honor system over at Riot Games. I think about how Blizzard has messed around with endorsements, and you know, how that's really useful because you're able to kind of give shout outs, and that actually helps when individuals want that affirmation and want that validation. But you can also tie it into tech. You know, we think about Bungie and how they have a friendly gesture system, which is mapped to the directional keypad or control pad. And I think about how, you know, Valve doesn't just want to sort of demonize those who are doing the wrong things. Well, they don't do that, but they're making sure they don't do that by also highlighting and spotlighting and celebrating those users who are doing the right things. And so bottom line, it takes innovation, it takes experimenting. I hope that, you know, platforms have a leash where they're able to say, yeah, I want to try this. I want to try this. We could sandbox it. We could do it as a pilot test over in this region, but we should see what happens. And then ideally it works, it bears fruit, and you're able to deploy it worldwide. But I think that it's essential to continue to figure out ways to induce and contribute to, you know, more civility and more positivity when it comes to gameplay, when it comes to interactions.
There's two elements here for me, partially because of my background and what I do every day. One, because I live in the landscape of detection, so knowing very well what's actually happening, so that you can make smarter decisions for everybody involved. And so I think about what are the components of healthy communities. And one of the things that I've talked to Matt about before is exciting about bullying in particular is that in some ways, healthy communities are like a photo negative of bullying, harassing, dominated communities, because there's still this element of interaction and repetition being really important to social cohesion and dynamics. And that's good news for platforms. Platforms rely upon engagement. And they rely upon engagement also to get the data they need to figure out what's going on. So whereas bullying may be these repetitive, intentional, malicious, abusive behaviors, healthy communities have repetitive, pro-social, interactive components. And so you're in some ways looking at the light to the dark. But then another element, which my background in extremism really helps with, which is resilience, right? We know, for example, even if we can't change people today with what's going on a platform. We know if there's too much bullying, okay, we've got this issue, but if we also have a lot of healthy pro-social dynamics, bonded people who are authentically interacting, then those bonded people are going to be more resilient to bullying and all sorts of harms. And so being able to see what's going on and being able to find creative ways, which depends on the platform and the subcultures, to make the communities resilient, recognize the unique qualities on a given platform because a gaming platform and the way people bond in a game is going to be different than a social platform naturally. And know that we always want more of the good stuff. We'll withstand the bad stuff. And if we're at the same time reducing the amount of bad stuff, in this case, bullying, then it's a much bigger win. So I find that really exciting because you can work on all these things at once using the same data and the same tools.
I love that. We've done work on resilience, and it's so important for platforms to figure out ways to remind users of their own autonomy, their own agency, whether it's a dating app, whether it's a gaming platform, a social media site. Because when they do that, then they're more likely to take advantage of the tools. Then they don't just sort of take the harassment and suffer silently.
My nerd brain is loving this conversation. I just want to get that out there. I love to have these moments. Yeah, shared a few things here. So yeah, we do have a conversation tomorrow. So if folks have questions, yeah, no, Heidi, great point. Promote users to be the best version of themselves. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them in there. If you're a member of TSC, we have a call tomorrow. You get a chance to ask more one-to-one questions or more topic-specific questions for either Chris, Samir, or hopefully have Lauren tomorrow. That's a technical issue on our part. So apologies to Laura. She is amazing too. So love to have you join that or ask the questions here. If you're not a member of TSC, please join. We'd love to get you invited to that event and have some more of those conversations. As we're waiting on that, and just calling out all the great content. If you enjoyed hearing from Samir, there is his LinkedIn. I encourage you to reach out. I know both, I think we definitely met through social, but I know doing conferences and advising different companies in various capacities. I know Samir's done a lot of work there. And if you haven't done it, I highly encourage you to check out the Cyberbully Research Center's website. They have an amazing plethora, I don't need to use that word often, a plethora of resources when it comes to research, trends, age-specific, behavior-specific, you name it. But they do some amazing work there, so I highly encourage you to check that out. Chris, I get to work with Chris, so I'm biased. I like her a lot. But yeah, Chris, I'll share her LinkedIn is there as well. So if you're interested in any of the stuff that she has shared, that's a great place to kind of connect with Chris, learn more about her work and stuff she's not only done with us, but abroad outside of Spectrum as well. Some amazing work there. But yeah, I encourage everyone to kind of reach out there. Check in. Do we get any questions yet? I haven't seen any questions yet. And we were just too good. That's all it is. We were too good and we answered everything. Thank you, Kate. So with that, I have questions then. So we got a few more minutes here as we wrap it up. What are, we talked about, healthy communities, other stuff. What are some of the best resources, interventions you've come across as we think about supporting individuals online? What are some of the best ways that you've seen platforms sort of approach this and have a positive impact on individuals?
One thing that I wanted to mention, Matt, is the fact that I'm a fan of transparency reports, and I know that, the outside world might think that they're biased, but I think that if you're just putting them out, twice a year, you're able to give everyone, society, a general idea of what you've been working on, whether there's been increases or decreases. Maybe you can also talk about some of your initiatives and how they've worked. It's important to remain top of mind, the fact, trust and safety on your platform. And so by putting out these transparency reports and maybe infographics related to it or tweets, whatever you want to use, I think it really, really helps. And of course that sort of details what you're doing internally, but you can also put out, formal reports as you work with external partners as well.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of platforms projecting who they are very clearly, repeatedly in ways that build the type of communities that they really want. I know as just a regular online user, I gravitate towards spaces where I know what they are about. They remind me of what they are about, what type of experience they want me to have. I also love transparency reports. It's like we learn a lot about a community by how willing they are to show us exactly what's going on, and also following that up and seeing whether a company's values and their reporting and the experience on their platform are in alignment. And the companies that really work on that stand out, and that is always going to be reflected in the communities. That annoying adage of, birds of a feather, like it really does. We're still people online. So when platforms take great pride in who they are as, as creators of community, composed of diverse individuals, and they line that up and they really pay careful attention to that, that really distinguishes them. And you get the type of participation and trust required to manage all the tricky elements, including bullying. There's always going to be trends on a platform that we don't want. But when you have trust and like who your people are and how to navigate as a user, that experience and the ability to problem solve is just so dramatically different than in communities where there's some muddiness about what they're really about or how they're managing things or how to even report unfortunate experiences as a user. I'm really just doing what we do as people. If we use a metaphor as being a good host, and you're a good host as a platform, and you think about what that really means, then you're going to create experiences that you can be proud of and manage anything along the way, and a lot more quickly and with a lot less concern for whether you're doing it right.
I'd also like to add that, and I absolutely agree. I also like to add, just in terms of, when you're thinking about offenders or aggressors, I would recommend leaning in the direction of a restorative approach. We've already brought up how, you do have some heinous offenders. And in those cases, of course, you want to ban IP addresses or ban IMEI numbers or other device IDs. But generally speaking, individuals, they just mess up. They get caught up in the situation or the circumstance, and they mouth off, or they engage in behavior that they're not very proud of. And so if we just also come down extremely hard on them and cast them away, then unfortunately they're going to get very cheesed off, and they might want to sort of exact revenge, however that looks like, because they possess such a negative view of the platform because they never took the time to understand that, okay, this was a mistake because of these situational variables, etc. And I feel that individuals want to be restored and they want to be redeemed in certain capacities. And so let's try to bring them back on the platform after whatever discipline, informal or formal, you take, because I think that will just help with the image and the reputation and the general feel of engagement that occurs.
That's a great call out. I just had a conversation with a brand new startup app that was coming out of the gate, and it's a very specific community, and they were going to have a zero tolerance policy. And that's one of the exact things we talked about, right? Is how do you sort of encourage members that if you initially just kick them all off, then it's like, what did that individual learn, gain, or grow from that experience, right? Other than now they're just probably angry at the app. Yeah. And I think too, to both your points, say what you will about all of the fun emerging legislation, particularly in the United States, coming at the state level. One underlying current to every single bill, transparency reports. Governments want to know more what platforms are doing. And that is a consistent theme I've heard across the board from not just the US, but from other countries as well, is that call for transparency. And it's tough with the data and privacy rights, things like that. But I think it's a great conversation that needs to keep happening and something that platforms are interested in. And I think individuals would really like more of, just a matter of how we make it happen. Yeah. Well, with that, Anna, instant bullying do need to be zero tolerance. Yes. No, you're right. And that's where I think having, Ang, to your point, that's a great call out, but having some type of strike system, point system, whatever it is that you want to have in there in order to identify that is crucial. And then tools for users, but also I think proactive detection by platforms too, right? Having haven't taken in there. There's so many. We could have had another hour. Oh my gosh. I'm hoping y'all join TSC tomorrow, because there's a lot of this stuff we can definitely dive into and have, ask some more personal questions, tactical questions, and really get into the nitty gritty. So I encourage you to join for that. With that, round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much, both Samir and Chris, for joining. Appreciate you both being here.